Welcome to the INFOWARS Nightly News. I'm David Knight. It's Monday, November 10th, 2014.
Tonight, lack of transparency is key to fooling stupid Americans. Then, a federal judge rules that the public has a right to know about face scanning cameras. And are vaccines a ploy to train parents? That's next on the INFOWARS Nightly News.
Listen to me, you little punk. Gonna do what we say, we're gonna break your legs. That's what we're gonna do. You like living like that? Well, you're about to, okay?
Now, yesterday, Sunday, November the 9th, was the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was a lot of celebration in Europe. The BBC reports some 8,000 helium balloons were released in the night sky over Germany's capital. Now, these were balloons that they had set up for about a week. They had them on poles, as you can see here in the picture, and they released them to the crowds, essentially giving people an idea of what it felt like to have that imposing presence, as the Berlin Wall was an imposing presence. I think it's time for us to take a step back and ask, as William Binney has told us time and again here on the INFOWARS Nightly News, William Binney, former technical director of the NSA, how much like Berlin, how much like the East German Stasi, America's government has become. Think about some of the things that have come to light, because the key was not the fall of the wall. The key was taking down the Stasi. That's the message that we got over and over again over the weekend. Now, of course, with the Stasi, as people have said, they were amazed when they went back and looked at the records. They were amazed at the depth of knowledge that the Stasi had. They said they had files that contained every record of their every movement, and they said it was full of just junk. That's exactly what William Binney has said about our own spying, that there's so much stuff there. They've basically created a much, much larger haystack to try to find the needle. So collecting everything, as he and other whistleblowers at the NSA protested after September 11th, 2001, as they changed their policies to collect everything, not only on every American, but on essentially individuals in every country. The bottom line is that the Stasi operated without limits. They operated without shame, just as our government is doing today. They monitored people so they could suppress any and all political dissidents, just like we see the IRS doing with the Tea Party, just like we see them doing with Dinesh D'Souza, and they worked against anyone who was nonconformist to the party line. As we're starting to see now with the government moving against, say, people who object to performing homosexual marriage because of religious objections, they can't have that kind of nonconformity. Now, NPR did a story this weekend, the man who disobeyed his boss and opened the Berlin Wall. Now, the way they tell it, it's basically one guy who was lieutenant colonel in charge of the main checkpoint coming into the West, a Harold Yeager. And they said he stood down and allowed people to cross en masse. But even he said it wasn't him, it was the people. He said, I didn't open the wall. The people who stood here, they did it, said the 71-year-old. He said their will was so great that there was no other alternative but to open the border. Exactly. That's what's going to take it down. Reagan stood at the wall and said, Mr. Gorbachev, take down this wall. Reagan didn't take down the wall. Gorbachev didn't take down the wall. It was the people who were sick and tired of a criminal government that was breathing down their throat, that was harassing them at every turn, that was watching their every move. They were the ones who rose up and took it down. He pointed out that as he was growing up, he was thoroughly taken in by the communist propaganda. He said he learned as a communist who served his homeland, does that sound familiar? As a Border Patrol agent in the much-hated Ministry for State Security, that's what they call the Stasi. He said that he saw the Berlin Wall as a rampart against fascism. See, he saw it as something that was protecting the people rather than something that was jailing them. And that's what we have to be concerned about as we call for a wall across the border. We have to be very careful that even though we have a legitimate reason to control people who come into our country and become citizens, I don't think a wall is the right way to do it. We need to remove the disincentives, the incentives rather, for people to come here. The illegal alien benefits that are allowed, that are drawing people into the country, the amnesty that's drawing the people into the country, but not put up some kind of a wall that is eventually going to become our prison. Now, NPR tries to make this about one guy who stood down, but it was the people who stood up. The BBC got it right. The BBC asked the question, did a prayer meeting really bring down the Berlin Wall and end the Cold War? They point out that ignoring death threats and huge banks of armed police thousands of people gathered at St. Nicholas Church in the East German city of Leipzig on the 9th of October to pray for peace before this all began. They got a crowd there of 70,000 people. Where this lieutenant colonel was at that checkpoint, there were 10,000 people. And those people wanted their freedom. Part of the freedom that they were looking for was their freedom of movement, which we now see coming under attack in America. We haven't exactly seen it yet. We've seen the foundation for it in controlling our transportation with government-controlled, computer-driven cars. But that's the way this is going to come down, with that and with border controls. We need to understand where this is headed. We need to understand history. We need to understand that these people stood up against it because they were sick and tired of a criminal regime. This is exactly what we saw at the Bundy Ranch. We heard ranchers there saying that they were not going to be taken down by these criminals who had come into their community, these criminal federal agents who had been attacking women, who had been tasering people, who had set up free speech areas. They said, "You're not going to take me down if I'm on a horse. You're going to have to shoot me off." They wanted their freedom enough that they stood up en masse, stood up against armed guards, just as the people in Berlin did. That's what it's going to take to turn this thing down. Now, we see as this is developing in America, look at this article on INFOWARS today. Federal judge says the public has a right to know about the FBI's facial recognition database. See, authoritarian regimes like East Germany and the US are always, they're relentless, they're vicious, but look at this story. They are also amazingly incompetent. And that's not a source of comfort. That only makes them even more dangerous because they get false positives. As we look at this article about the database, they point out that a federal judge has ruled that the FBI's futuristic facial recognition database is deserving of scrutiny from open government advocates. In other words, they have standing to sue the FBI to get information about this database because the FBI has not vetted this through the required privacy oversight. They say that they have validated a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit that has been filed by the Electronic Privacy Information Center, that's usually abbreviated as EPIC. EPIC is suing over a 2010 government report that revealed that the FBI's facial recognition technology could fail up to 20% of the time. Now, privacy groups believe the failure rate may be much higher, as a search can be considered successful if the correct suspect is listed within the top 50 candidates. They say the program, a biometric database that includes iris scans and palm prints along with facial recognition, became fully operational this summer despite not undergoing an internal review known as the Privacy Impact Assessment. And they haven't had that review since 2008. They've had plenty of time to do it, but they're not interested. The way the government works is essentially through lies to forward their agenda. We're going to take a look at 3 ways that the Obama administration has essentially lied and tricked the American people. First one, of course, is Obamacare. And we see that today, one of the architects of Obamacare came out and talked about how they got this passed. Listen to what he had to say.
If you had a law which said healthy people are going to pay in, it made explicit that healthy people pay in and sick people get money, it would not have passed. Okay, just like the people, lack of transparency is a huge political advantage. And basically, call it the stupidity of the American voter or whatever. But basically, that was really, really critical to getting the thing to pass. And, it's the second best argument. Look, I wish Mark was right. We can make it all transparent. But I'd rather have this law than not. So it's kind of like his reporter story. Yeah, there's things I wish I could change, but I'd rather have this law than not.
That's right. The way they took over America's health care, or hope to take it over, is through lies, through a lack of transparency. That's the way, as we'll see later in the broadcast, they want to take over the internet, and eventually they want to use hidden trade agreements, a lack of transparency in these negotiated trade agreements, and there's bilateral support on this. They want to use that to create trading blocks that are a stepping stone to global governance. But let's look at what he just said here. He said, the bill was written in a tortured way to make sure that the CBO did not score the mandate as taxes. See, when they got it passed, they told everybody, don't worry, it's not a tax, it's a mandate. And then when they got it before the Supreme Court says it's a tax, it's not a mandate. And of course, you had the Supreme Court Chief Justice Roberts, who had already written a dissenting opinion and all of a sudden changed his mind, did a complete 180, and for the first time, you had a Supreme Court justice write both the dissenting and the majority opinion. So let's repeat. What he said was the bill was written in a tortured way to make sure that they didn't score the mandate as taxes. And then he goes on to say a lack of transparency is a huge political advantage. In other words, if you can lie to people, if you can cover up what's really going on, that's a big political advantage, isn't it? They said that it was going to be a mandate when they were running it through Congress, and then when it got challenged in the Supreme Court said it was a tax. So they tell you whatever is convenient at the time. They never let anybody see what was in it. Of course, they said they had to pass it to find out what was in it. That is exactly the same strategy we see them pursuing with everything. Look at this article about vaccines. An immunologist admits that babies are only vaccinated to train parents. And we have a quote of them laughing about how they train the parents. Listen to this quote.
It's interesting. I was on the phone with Mark County Public Health last week with one of their vaccine nurses. And she was like, oh, you're talking about vaccines? Make sure you tell them they have to do that year shot because the first 3 don't work. And I was like, yeah, I know.
Remember when we were talking about the NSA and they said they had absolutely no shame and no control? That's what we hear when we hear these medical professionals laughing about the fact that they are injecting babies in the first year of their life with multiple injections, which of course makes them a lot of money, and they're enjoying that, but laughing about how totally ineffective it is and how they are training the parents. Now, Paul Joseph Watson points out in this article, a shocking study published in a prestigious medical journal in 2011 found a direct statistical link between higher vaccine doses and infant mortality rates in the developed world. Now, they pointed out that the countries that had the lowest vaccination rate had the highest or the best infant mortality, in other words, the lowest rate of infant mortality. And as the vaccination rates went up, infant mortality also increased with that. So you see that even though these vaccines are not effective in terms of protecting the children, they're not safe. But they lie to us about it. They know that that's there. So just as they lied about healthcare and just as they're lying about the internet control that we see coming up, they're also lying to us about the healthcare of our children, of ourselves, of what they're putting into the vaccines. Now look at what they're doing with the internet. Just as they used lies to take over or try to take over our healthcare, they're now using lies and disinformation to try to take over the internet because, of course, that is the high ground in the information war. Obama wants to turn the internet into a public utility. He says, to put these protections in place, I'm asking the FCC to reclassify internet service under Title II of a law known as the Telecommunications Act. In other words, what protections? Well, this is the protections of net neutrality. The idea that there isn't going to be some special toll road, a fast lane that only the big boys can play in, that will eventually shut down everybody else or be used to shut them down. Instead, having the kind of internet that we've always had. Now, the FCC doesn't really care one way or the other whether or not we have net neutrality or whether or not we have a toll road. They simply want to be appointed in control of the internet. And we've seen multiple times in the last year that they're very interested in regulating content. We should understand that, of course, the FCC used to do this with radio called the Fairness Doctrine. And we've seen that they even wanted to extend their survey to looking at print media. Nothing that is under the jurisdiction of the FCC, and neither is the internet. Look at this article from the Wall Street Journal. The FCC net neutrality plan calls for more power. That's exactly what it is. It is a power grab for this bureaucracy. They want to build their empire, and they want to take over control of free speech. Now, this was October the 30th. The Wall Street Journal pointed out that the head of the FCC is laying the groundwork for expanding the agency's authority over broadband service. And this has been going on the entire year. Look at this, going back to April 23rd of this last year. The FCC in a shift backs fast lanes for web traffic. This was the New York Times reporting this. They said the FCC said that it would propose new rules to allow companies like Disney, Google, or Netflix to pay internet service providers like Comcast and Verizon for special faster lanes to send video and other content to their customers. Now, if that's going to happen, if the FCC is going to allow the big boys to get special privileges, what that's really called is regulatory capture. The big communication companies are going to capture the FCC in the same way that Monsanto has captured the FDA. Always happens that way.